courtroom felt colder than usual that morning. Not because of the air, but because of the silence hanging heavy in the room. People sat on hard benches, shifting slightly, whispering when they thought no one was listening. At the front, the judge had not yet arrived, and the lawyers were quietly arranging papers. In the middle row sat the wife. She kept her hands folded in her lap and her eyes lowered. Her clothes were plain, neat, and simple. Nothing about her suggested power, wealth, or confidence. To most people watching, she looked like someone already defeated. Across the room sat the husband. He looked calm, almost relaxed. His posture was straight, his suit expensive, and his lawyers sat close by, speaking in low, confident voices. They smiled often, as if this was just another task to finish before lunch. Every small detail gave the impression that he was in control. Anyone entering the room for the first time could guess who they thought would win. The wife had arrived alone. No friends sat beside her. No family members whispered words of support. When she took her seat, she did so quietly, without looking around. A few people noticed and exchanged glances. Some felt sorry for her. Others judged her. In their minds, a woman who came alone to a divorce trial must have nothing left. No support, no strength, no chance. The clerk called the case, and the judge entered. Everyone stood, then sat again. The sound of chairs moving echoed through the room. The judge's eyes scanned the space, briefly pausing on both sides. When the judge reached the wife, there was a moment of silence. She did not meet the judge's gaze. Instead, she kept looking down, as if she wanted to disappear into the wooden bench beneath her. The husband's lawyer stood first. His voice was clear and confident. He spoke about timelines, agreements, and assets. He painted a picture of a marriage where only one person carried the weight. According to him, the wife had depended fully on the husband. She had no role in building the life they shared. She had no claim to what existed now. As he spoke, he occasionally glanced toward the wife, as if expecting a reaction. She gave none. The judge listened carefully, nodding once or twice. The room remained quiet. A few people in the audience leaned forward, interested but already convinced they knew how this would end. The lawyer's words flowed easily, like he had said them many times before. It was clear this was not his first case like this. To him, this was routine. When it was time for the wife's side to speak, there was a short pause. She did not have a large legal team. Just one lawyer sat beside her, flipping through a thin folder. He stood and spoke calmly, without drama. He asked the judge for patience and said this case was not as simple as it looked. His voice was respectful, but it lacked the sharp confidence of the other side. The wife remained silent. She did not whisper to her lawyer. She did not react when her husband's lawyer made certain claims. Her stillness almost felt strange. Some people wondered if she was scared. Others assumed she had already given up. Inside her mind, however, a storm was quietly moving. She remembered the early days of the marriage. The small apartment, the long nights, the unpaid bills, the times she stayed awake while the husband slept, worrying about how they would survive another month. She remembered skipping meals so he could eat. She remembered standing behind him while he signed papers, believing their future was shared. But none of those memories showed on her face. She had learned long ago that showing pain only invited more of it. So she stayed quiet. She listened. She waited. The judge asked her a simple question. Did she understand the claims being made? She lifted her head slightly and answered in a soft but clear voice that she did. That was all. No anger. No tears. Just a calm response. The judge studied her for a moment longer than expected, then moved on. As the hearing continued, the husband's lawyer spoke again. This time, his tone became firmer. He suggested that the wife had agreed to the separation terms already and was now delaying the process. He hinted that she was being unreasonable. A few people in the room nodded quietly, accepting the idea without question. The wife's lawyer objected politely, reminding the court that no final agreement had been reached. The judge allowed him to continue, but it was clear the balance of power in the room still leaned heavily to one side. During a short break, The wife remained seated while others stepped outside or spoke in small groups. No one approached her. She sat alone, staring at the floor. Her hands trembled slightly, but she quickly pressed them together, steadying herself. She took a slow breath. This was only the beginning. She knew how this looked. She knew what people were thinking, that she was weak, that she had been foolish, that she had trusted too much and lost everything. But she also knew something they did not. The silence they mistook for weakness was a choice, and choices had brought her here for a reason. When the judge returned, the room settled again. The husband leaned back confidently. His lawyer whispered something to him, and he smiled. It was the kind of smile that said victory was already close. The judge announced that this was only the first phase of the trial. More evidence and witnesses would be allowed in the coming sessions. The date for the next hearing was set. People began to gather their belongings, already discussing the case as if the outcome was obvious. As the wife stood to leave, she felt dozens of eyes on her back. Pity, judgment, curiosity. She walked slowly, keeping her head high this time. Not proud, not angry, just steady. She passed by her husband without looking at him. He did not look at her either. To him, she was already part of the past. Outside the courtroom, the noise of the building rushed back in. Footsteps, voices, phones ringing. The wife paused for a moment near the exit. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Her chest felt tight, but her resolve felt stronger than it had in years. She reached into her bag and checked her phone. No messages yet. That was expected. She slipped it back inside and walked out into the daylight alone. To anyone watching, it looked like the walk of someone with nothing left. But inside her, there was certainty. This was not the full story. Not even close. And soon, the courtroom would learn that silence does not always mean surrender. Sometimes it simply means the truth has not arrived yet. The days after the first hearing passed slowly. For the wife, time felt heavier than usual, like every hour carried a weight she could not put down. She returned to her small apartment, the same one she had moved into after leaving the shared home. It was quiet there, too quiet. The walls were bare, the furniture simple, and the silence reminded her of how much her life had changed. She replayed the courtroom scene again and again in her mind. The confident voice of the husband's lawyer. The way people looked at her with pity. The judge's careful expressions. None of it surprised her, yet it still hurt. She had expected to feel anger, but instead she felt something deeper. Determination. She had come too far to let this be the end. Every morning, she woke up early. Not because she had somewhere to go, but because sleep no longer came easily. She made tea, sat near the window, and watched the city wake up. Cars passed, people hurried to work, and life moved on as if nothing important was happening. For her, everything felt like it was on pause. She began organizing old papers stored in boxes she had carried with her when she left the house. Receipts, letters, old contracts, small notes written years ago. Each piece of paper carried a memory. Some were painful, others bittersweet. She didn't rush. She handled each one carefully, like proof that her life had mattered. At the same time, the husband was preparing in his own way. He met with his lawyers frequently, confident that the case would be resolved quickly. To him, the wife's silence meant weakness. He believed she had no resources left, no allies, no real argument. His focus was on protecting what he saw as his success. In private conversations, he spoke of the marriage as a mistake, something that had slowed him down. He told people she had depended on him for everything. He said she was emotional, impractical, and incapable of understanding business matters. Those words made him feel justified, even powerful. Back in the courtroom world, documents were exchanged. Requests were filed. The process moved forward, slowly but steadily. The wife attended every required meeting. She listened more than she spoke. Her lawyer often advised her to stay calm and patient. She followed that advice, even when frustration pressed hard against her chest. One afternoon, while sorting through an old folder, she found something she had almost forgotten. A document from the early days of the marriage. It showed decisions made together, signatures side by side. It wasn't dramatic, but it was honest. It reminded her that the story being told in court was incomplete. She placed the document aside, her hands steady. For the first time since the hearing, she allowed herself a small breath of relief. Not because everything was solved, but because she knew the truth existed. And truth, she believed, had a way of finding its moment. As the next hearing date approached, tension grew. The wife's lawyer asked her questions gently, guiding her through possible scenarios. He explained how the process worked, what might be challenged, and what patience would be required. She listened carefully, nodding, asking only what she needed to understand. At night, doubts sometimes crept in. She wondered if staying silent had been a mistake, if she should have spoken up sooner, if the judge had already formed an opinion. These thoughts kept her awake, staring at the ceiling in the dark. But each morning, she reminded herself why she was doing this. Not for revenge, not for pride, but for fairness. The day of the second hearing arrived. The courtroom looked the same, but the atmosphere felt different. There was a quiet tension in the air, like something waiting to happen. The wife arrived early again, alone. She sat in the same seat, hands folded, breathing slowly. The husband arrived shortly after, surrounded by his legal team. His confidence had not faded. If anything, it had grown. He smiled politely at people he recognized, acting as though this was just another appointment in his busy schedule. When the judge entered, the proceedings began quickly. This time, questions were sharper. The judge asked about financial records, timelines, and contributions. The husband's lawyer answered smoothly, presenting polished arguments and neatly organized files. When the wife's lawyer spoke, he focused on clarity rather than drama. He asked for time. He asked for consideration. He stated that not all contributions could be measured in numbers. Some people in the room shifted uncomfortably, but the judge listened. The wife was asked again if she wished to speak. She stood slowly, her legs steady despite the attention. She spoke briefly. She did not accuse. She did not beg. She simply stated that she had been part of every stage of the life they built, that she had supported, sacrificed, and believed. Her voice did not shake. When she finished, she sat back down. The room was quiet for a moment, not because her words were loud, but because they were honest. The judge made a note and thanked her. As the hearing ended, it was clear that things were not as one-sided as before. No decision was made. More information was requested. More time was granted. The husband's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of mild irritation. Outside the courtroom, the wife paused again near the exit. This time, her phone vibrated. A message appeared on the screen. It was short, just a few words asking if she was holding up. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she typed a simple reply. Yes, I am. She slipped the phone back into her bag and stepped outside. The air felt different, lighter, not because the fight was over, but because she no longer felt completely alone. People watching her walk away would still think she was fragile, still think she had little chance. But the truth was quietly forming beneath the surface. Pieces were coming together. Support was closer than anyone realized. The trial was no longer just about winning or losing. It was about being seen. And slowly, the wife was stepping out of the shadow others had placed her in. What no one in that courtroom knew yet was that this was only the calm before a much bigger shift. And when it came, it would change everything. The weeks before the next hearing were the hardest. The waiting pressed on the wife more than the courtroom ever had. Every day felt stretched, like time was testing her patience. She kept herself busy, not because she had many places to go, but because staying still made her thoughts too loud. She continued sorting through old records, carefully labeling folders and arranging papers in neat stacks. Some nights she stayed up late, reading documents again and again, making sure she understood every detail. She was not a legal expert, but she knew her own life. She knew what she had done, what she had given, and what had been taken for granted. Occasionally, she met with her lawyer. Their conversations were calm and focused. He explained what the other side was pushing for and where the risks were. He never promised victory. He only promised honesty. That mattered to her more than empty reassurance. Meanwhile, the husband's confidence was beginning to crack in small, almost invisible ways. It showed in his impatience during meetings, in the way he asked the same questions twice, in how often he checked his phone while his lawyer spoke. He still believed he would win, but doubt had started knocking quietly at the door. He was surprised that the case was taking longer than expected. In his mind, it should have been simple. He had assumed the wife would accept whatever was offered and disappear from his life. Her refusal to do so unsettled him more than he admitted. At social gatherings, he avoided talking about the trial. When people asked, he brushed it off with short answers. He did not want sympathy or questions. He wanted control. And control, for the first time in a long while, felt uncertain. The wife felt the tension too, but she carried it differently. She had spent years adjusting herself to survive. Now, she was learning how to stand still without breaking. On some days, she walked through parks just to breathe. On others, she sat quietly with a cup of tea, letting her thoughts pass without fighting them. One afternoon, she received a message asking if she could meet that evening. The message was simple, polite, and familiar. She read it twice before replying yes. Her heart beat a little faster than usual. They met in a small, quiet place. No one drew attention. The conversation was careful at first. General questions. Simple answers. Then, slowly, the tone shifted. Concern replaced distance. Support replaced silence. She did not explain everything. She did not need to. Just being heard was enough. She left the meeting feeling steadier than she had in weeks. Whatever happened next, she would not face it completely alone. As the hearing date approached, the courtroom filled with more observers than before. Word had spread that the case was no longer straightforward. People were curious. Some expected drama. Others expected a quiet settlement. Few expected anything meaningful to change. The wife arrived earlier than usual that day. She sat, hands folded, eyes forward. She felt calm, not because she was fearless, but because she had accepted uncertainty. Fear loses power when it is acknowledged. The husband entered later, his expression serious. His lawyers were focused, their movements precise. They spoke in quick whispers, reviewing notes. He nodded, but his eyes kept scanning the room, as if searching for something he could not name. When the judge arrived, the proceedings began without delay. This session felt heavier. Questions went deeper. The judge asked about timelines that had not been discussed before. Financial records were examined more closely. Assumptions were challenged. The husband's lawyer maintained his confidence, but his tone was sharper now, less relaxed. When certain questions came up, he paused longer before answering. The judge noticed. Everyone did. The wife's lawyer presented additional material. Nothing dramatic, just clear, factual information. He spoke slowly, making sure every word was understood. The wife watched the judge's face, noticing how carefully he listened. At one point, the judge asked the wife to clarify something. She stood again. Her voice was steady. She explained a decision made years ago, one that had shaped the direction of their lives. She did not blame. She simply stated what had happened. The room was quiet when she finished. The judge nodded and thanked her. The husband avoided her gaze. As the session continued, it became clear that the narrative presented at the start of the case was no longer holding. The image of a dependent, uninvolved wife no longer fit. Small cracks had become visible, and through those cracks, a fuller picture was emerging. Still, no final decision was made. The judge announced that further testimony would be allowed. More people could be called. More documents could be submitted. The case was far from over. This time, when the session ended, the mood in the room felt different. Less certain. Less dismissive. People spoke in lower voices. Some looked back at the wife as she gathered her belongings. Outside, she stood near the steps, letting the noise of the street wash over her. Her phone vibrated again. Another message. Short. Reassuring. She replied with a quiet thank you. Across the street, the husband spoke sharply to one of his lawyers. His frustration was visible now. He did not like surprises, and this case had become one. That evening, the wife sat alone in her apartment, the lights low. She thought about how far she had come from the woman who first walked into the courtroom. Head down, shoulders tense. She was still quiet, still careful, but she was no longer shrinking. She knew something important was approaching. Not a confrontation, but a moment of truth. The kind that changes how people see you. What she did not yet know was how powerful that moment would be, or how unexpected the next hearing would become. The balance was shifting slowly but surely, and when it tipped, it would not be possible to ignore. The next hearing arrived sooner than expected. The wife woke up before dawn, her mind already alert. She moved slowly through her morning routine, choosing her clothes with care. Not to impress, but to feel steady. When she left her apartment, she paused at the door for a moment, resting her hand on the handle as if grounding herself. Today felt different. The courthouse was busier than usual. Voices echoed through the halls, footsteps overlapping, security moving people along. As she walked toward the courtroom, she noticed something that made her stop. Near the entrance, a small group stood together, speaking quietly. They turned when they saw her. For a brief second, she froze. Then she felt it. Not fear, not surprise, relief. They did not rush toward her or make a scene. They simply nodded, their expressions calm and sure. One of them stepped closer and asked softly if she was ready. She answered yes, her voice steady, though her chest felt tight. They walked in together. The change in the room was immediate, even before anyone spoke. People looked up. Heads turned. Whispers started. The wife took her usual seat, but this time, she was not alone. The bench beside her filled quietly. Their presence was respectful, controlled, and confident. Across the room, the husband noticed. His relaxed posture stiffened. His eyes narrowed slightly as he leaned forward, trying to understand what he was seeing. He whispered to his lawyer, who glanced back at the group with a questioning look. The judge entered, and the room stood. As everyone sat again, the judge's eyes paused longer than usual on the wife's side. He made a small note before beginning. The session opened with routine matters, but the atmosphere had shifted. There was a sense that something important was about to happen. The husband's lawyer stood to speak, but his tone lacked its usual ease. He presented arguments similar to before, repeating claims about independence, ownership, and contribution. When it was time for the wife's side, her lawyer stood and requested permission to introduce additional witnesses. The judge nodded. The first person stood. They spoke clearly and calmly. About early years. About shared decisions. About sacrifices made quietly and without praise. They did not exaggerate. They did not accuse. They simply described what they had seen. Then another stood. And another. Each voice added a layer. A fuller picture. Not just of finances, but of effort, patience, and support that had been invisible until now. Documents were presented. Old records. Messages. Agreements signed long ago. None of it was dramatic on its own. Together it was undeniable. The wife remained seated, her hands resting in her lap. She did not smile. She did not look at the husband. She kept her eyes forward, breathing slowly. This was not about proving anything loudly. It was about letting the truth speak for itself. The judge asked careful questions. He listened closely. He asked for clarification when needed. Each answer came without hesitation. The room grew quieter with every exchange. When the husband's lawyer stood to object, his words felt thinner than before. He questioned relevance. He questioned timing. But the judge allowed the testimony to continue. The husband shifted in his seat. His confidence was gone now, replaced by tension. He avoided looking at the witnesses. His jaw tightened. For the first time, he looked unsure. At one point, the judge asked the wife to stand. She did. He asked her if the testimony aligned with her experience. She answered simply that it did. Nothing more. Nothing less. The room held its breath. The judge nodded slowly. As the session went on, it became clear that the story presented at the start of the trial had fully unraveled. The idea of a helpless, uninvolved wife no longer stood. What remained was a person who had chosen silence not because she lacked strength, but because she trusted the process. When the judge called for a short recess, the room buzzed. People whispered openly now. Some looked stunned. Others looked thoughtful. The wife sat quietly while those beside her spoke softly, offering calm reassurance. Across the room, the husband spoke sharply to his lawyer. His voice was low but strained. He had lost control of the narrative, and he knew it. When the judge returned, his tone was firm. He stated that the court had heard enough to reconsider earlier assumptions. He ordered a deeper review of records and postponed any preliminary conclusions. No ruling was given that day, but the shift was undeniable. As people gathered their belongings, the wife remained seated for a moment longer. She felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not victory, not relief, recognition. When she finally stood, people made space for her. Some nodded respectfully. Others avoided her eyes. Outside the courtroom, she stepped into the open air, surrounded but not overwhelmed. She listened as voices faded behind her. The city continued as it always had, unaware of what had changed inside those walls. She walked down the steps slowly, feeling the weight she had carried for so long begin to lift. She knew the trial was not over. There was still one final part ahead. But for the first time, she felt seen not as a figure in someone else's story, but as the author of her own. What happened inside that courtroom would not be forgotten. And when the final decision came, it would be shaped by truth that could no longer be ignored. The final hearing arrived on a quiet morning. The wife woke up before her alarm, her mind calm in a way she had not felt in months. She moved through her routine without rushing, noticing small details she had ignored before. The sound of water in the sink, the light through the window, the steady rhythm of her breathing. Whatever happened today, she knew she would be able to face it. When she reached the courthouse, the air felt familiar now. The halls no longer intimidated her. She walked with measured steps, greeting the security staff with a polite nod. Outside the courtroom, a few people were already waiting. Some recognized her and looked away. Others offered quiet smiles. She returned them gently and took her seat. The husband arrived shortly after. He looked tired. The confidence he once carried so easily was gone, replaced by tension he could no longer hide. His lawyers spoke to him in low voices, reviewing notes one last time. He nodded without really listening. His focus drifted, as if the weight of the moment had finally reached him. When the judge entered, the room settled quickly. There was no casual movement this time. Everyone understood the importance of the day. The judge began by summarizing the case, speaking slowly and clearly. He referred to earlier assumptions, new evidence, and the testimony that had shifted the direction of the trial. As he spoke, the wife listened without emotion on her face. She had already lived every part of this story. Hearing it spoken aloud no longer stirred fear or anger. It felt distant, like something she had finally stepped outside of. The judge invited final statements. The husband's lawyer stood first. His words were careful now, less aggressive, more restrained. He spoke about fairness and resolution, acknowledging that the situation was more complex than initially presented. He avoided repeating earlier claims. The room listened, but the energy had changed. This speech no longer carried certainty. When it was the wife's turn, her lawyer stood briefly, then sat. The judge looked directly at her and asked if she wished to speak. She stood slowly. The room was silent. She spoke simply. She said she had never wanted conflict. She said she believed in partnership and had lived by that belief. She explained that silence had been her way of surviving, not surrendering. She thanked the court for listening. Then she sat back down. There were no gasps, no dramatic reactions, just a deep stillness that lingered after her words. The judge nodded and began speaking again. His tone was firm, thoughtful, and measured. He addressed the imbalance that had shaped the early part of the trial. He acknowledged contributions that were not written in numbers but were no less real. He spoke about fairness not as generosity, but as responsibility. When he reached his decision, the room leaned in. The ruling was clear. The division would reflect shared effort and shared life. The wife would receive what the court determined was just, based on evidence and testimony. The assumptions that once painted her as helpless were formally dismissed. The husband lowered his gaze. His lawyers exchanged brief looks. There was nothing left to argue. The judge concluded by reminding both parties that the end of a marriage did not erase its history. He wished them both the ability to move forward with dignity. With that, it was over. For a moment, no one moved. Then chairs shifted. Papers gathered. Quiet conversations resumed. The wife remained seated, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She did not feel the urge to celebrate. What she felt instead was release. When she stood, the people beside her stood as well. They did not crowd her or speak loudly. Their support was quiet, steady, and respectful, just as it had been throughout the trial. As she walked out of the courtroom, she passed the husband. Their eyes met briefly. There was no anger there, only distance. He looked away first. Outside, the sky was bright. The noise of the city flowed around her, unchanged. She paused at the steps, letting the moment settle. The long fight was over, not with victory, but with truth. In the days that followed, life began to take shape again. Not all at once. Slowly, carefully, she returned to her routines, but with a lighter step. She made plans she had once postponed. She allowed herself to imagine a future that belonged to her alone. People who had doubted her now spoke differently. Some apologized. Others stayed silent. She did not dwell on either. What mattered was what she knew about herself now. She had learned that strength did not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it listens. Sometimes it endures until the right moment arrives. The courtroom had once seen her as powerless. The truth was simpler. She had never been helpless. She had been patient. And with patience, she had reclaimed her voice, her worth, and her place in her own story. As she moved forward, she carried no bitterness with her, only clarity, the kind that comes from being seen fully at last.